and it has been a tremendous experience. I have been to Santa Monica, California, Paramus, New Jersey, Atlantic City, New Jersey, 3 different boroughs of New York City, Queens, Brooklyn, and Manhattan. I have been to Dallas on November 22nd, 2013. Had a book signing there on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Then on to Lyndon Johnson's hometown of Austin. I stayed in the Driscoll Hotel in the very room where Johnson had trysts with his mistress. And I was roundly ignored by most of the Texas media. The book has become a New York Times bestseller. It is an Amazon bestseller. It is a USA Today bestseller. And I'm gratified about that. I have approached this subject as one would approach a murder investigation. Indeed, the murder investigation that should have been conducted in Dallas in 1963 and never was. And I have come to the conclusion, based on an enormous amount of research by those who have gone before me, that Lyndon Johnson was the linchpin of a plot that involved numerous others, and there is, I think, substantial research now. Thousands of books have been written making a very strong case for the involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency, for the involvement of organized crime, for the involvement of Big Texas Oil. And indeed, I make the case that Lyndon Baines Johnson had a unique relationship with each one of them. Now, let's talk about motive. First of all, it's important to remember that in 1960, Lyndon Baines Johnson blackmailed his way onto the Kennedy ticket. In fact, we know that President John F. Kennedy, or in that point, candidate John F. Kennedy, Senator John F. Kennedy, had selected Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri to be his running mate. He had asked Symington. Symington had accepted and was writing his acceptance speech. And that night, Lyndon Baines Johnson and House Speaker Sam Rayburn showed up in Jack Kennedy's hotel room in Los Angeles late at night, and they had with them a file, a dossier on John Kennedy's sex life. This had been supplied to them by J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover was a next-door neighbor of Lyndon Johnson's. He was a close political ally of Lyndon Johnson. Between 1951 and 1961, the FBI budget had tripled due to the good actions of Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson. When Lyndon Johnson stole his election in 1948 by a totally disputed and fraudulent 86 votes, J. Edgar Hoover flew down for the victory party at the Driscoll Hotel in Austin. So they were very close, and of course Hoover had his own motive. He knew he was facing mandatory retirement. He knew the Kennedys would put him out to pasture in 1964. So his motive was clear. In any event, Johnson's message for Kennedy was, you need me, you need Texas, and if you won't put me on the ticket, I'll just take this dossier and I'll give it to Dick Nixon. Now remember, Nixon and Kennedy were locked in a skin-tight race for president. So Kennedy demurs and he puts Lyndon Johnson on the ticket. The next morning, a reporter, in shock, asks the Senate Majority Leader, how could you give up one of the most powerful jobs in Washington, U.S. Senate Majority Leader, to be vice president, a job that has no power at all? And Lyndon Johnson says, you know, I checked, and 1 in 4 vice presidents have become president of the United States upon the death of the president, and frankly, I'm a gambling man and I like the odds. Maybe this is why Bobby Baker, who was the Secretary of the U.S. Senate, described by Lyndon Johnson as my right-hand man, quote unquote, says at the 1961 inaugural of Jack Kennedy, John F. Kennedy will not live out his term and he will die a violent death. This is 3 years before the assassination. Johnson is marginalized by the Kennedys. He is cut out of the decision-making process. He goes from being one of the most powerful men in Washington to being the least powerful. He is sent out on the road for funerals and ceremonial meetings with foreign presidents that have no significance. He is cut out of the loop, as they would say. But more importantly, in 1963, as the 1964 election approaches, Lyndon Johnson is in desperate trouble. He is jammed up in 2 enormous scandals of the time. The Bobby Baker scandal. Bobby Baker was, as I said previously, the Secretary of the U.S. Senate. He is Johnson's bag man. He has collected millions of dollars in illegal bribes on behalf of Lyndon Johnson. He and Johnson are partners in numerous illegal enterprises. And the U.S. Senate has opened investigative hearings into Bobby Baker on November 22nd, 1963, the very day of the assassination. Lyndon Johnson's neck is on the line. He also knows that he's under investigation by the U.S. Justice Department in the matter of Billy Sol Estes. Sol Estes is a flamboyant Texas wheeler dealer. He and Johnson have looted multi-millions of dollars from federal agricultural contracts that Johnson has delivered. Robert Kennedy has a full investigation. More importantly, Robert Kennedy, who wants Johnson off the 64 ticket, has leaked this information to Time Life. And Life magazine has 9 investigative reporters on the ground, a veritable hit team digging into Johnson's background for a December 1st expose issue, an issue that will bring Lyndon Johnson federal prosecution and prison. So it's not just being dumped from the 64 ticket, although President Jack Kennedy tells his secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, according to her memoirs, on the eve of leaving for Dallas, he says, Johnson will be off the 64 ticket, quote, I don't know who it will be, but it will not be Lyndon. He goes on to say that he is considering North Carolina Governor Terry Sanford, a moderate, a Southern racial moderate. So Johnson is a man staring into the abyss. He can either become President of the United States or he can go to the federal penitentiary. And therein lies his motive. Now, finding co-plotters is not all that difficult. Lyndon Johnson is the appropriator for the CIA. Lyndon Johnson sits on the secret subcommittee that passes the black box budgets, which are hidden in our aerospace budgets. The CIA cannot function without the hundreds of millions of dollars being delivered by the appropriator for the military-industrial complex, Lyndon Baines Johnson. No defense contract in Washington moves without a bribe for Lyndon Johnson. So Johnson is the godfather of the CIA. He sits on the Senate committee that forms the CIA. When he leaves the Senate to become vice president, he helps install Senator Harry F. Byrd, a close Johnson ally, in the congressional oversight that oversees the programs of the CIA. And then there's organized crime. Their motive? They gave $1 million to John Kennedy. They stole votes for John Kennedy. They intimidated voters for him in Chicago and in West Virginia. And in Texas, and in other states. And in return, Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, John Kennedy's father, who was a gangster himself, who was a partner of Frank Costello, the notorious New York mobster, essentially importing scotch by boat into Cape Cod, trucking it down to New York and sell it, which I think is called bootlegging. He promises the mob boys for a $1 million contribution and a little help on election day that the two gangsters, Santo Trafficante Jr., who runs the mob right here in Florida, and Carlos Marcello, who runs the mob in Texas and Louisiana, will not be deported. There are slow-moving deportation processes that have begun under Eisenhower that the mobsters are very concerned about. Well, you know the story. Robert Kennedy becomes the Attorney General. He double-crosses the mob. He puts wiretaps on Marcello and Trafficante. He harasses them. He actually kidnaps Carlos Marcello, the notorious gangster, flies him to Guatemala, where he has a phony passport, and dumps him in the jungle wearing nothing but his Brioni suit and his Gucci shoes. Needless to say, Marcello is not happy. Indeed, government wiretaps uncovered by the House Select Committee on Assassinations pick up both Trafficante and Marcello talking about the fact that Kennedy would be killed prior to his murder and taking credit in the case of Santo Trafficante after his murder. Lyndon Johnson's relationship with the mob? Why, Carlos Marcello is one of his biggest financial supporters. Lyndon Johnson takes a $55,000 a year bribe from the mob to protect their illegal gambling operations from the U.S. attorneys in Houston and Dallas and San Antonio. Indeed, within 24 hours of Johnson becoming president, the wiretaps put on organized crime by Attorney General Robert Kennedy are terminated by order of the President of the United States. And then there's Big Texas Oil. They are apoplectic because John Kennedy is talking about repealing the oil depletion allowance. The oil depletion allowance is a sweetheart tax break that Texas right-wing billionaire oil men are receiving. And by the way, it's still in place today, is yet to be repealed. But it will cost the Texas oil men hundreds of millions of dollars in additional federal taxes. And who has been the water carrier in Washington for the oil depletion allowance in the U.S. Senate? That would be Senator Lyndon Johnson, Vice President Lyndon Johnson. Now, everyone involved in this plot has their own motive. The CIA is upset about the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs invasion, in which President Kennedy has failed to order air support for the Cuban rebels storming the shores of Cuba. Hundreds of men are arrested, hundreds more are killed. It's a fiasco. They're also upset about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I know you could go through this bookstore and you'll find books that tell you how brave, gallant Jack Kennedy faced the Russians down, and they blinked and they removed our missiles from Cuba. And it was the closest this nation and this world has ever come. We came to the brink of nuclear Armageddon. The problem with that is it's not true. 40 years later, we learned that the Kennedy brothers gave up U.S. missiles in Turkey and Italy, changing the balance of power in the European theater. And that fact was kept from the American people for 40 years. You know what? If Ronald Reagan did that, they would have impeached him. But that secret was kept from us. The generals knew it, the Pentagon knew it, the CIA knew it, and they were unhappy. Why? Nikita Khrushchev took Jack Kennedy to the cleaners in the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was no on-site inspection in our deal with Khrushchev. Kennedy asked for it. Khrushchev refused. No American, no third party ever confirmed that the missiles left Cuba. That's a sorry fact. So the CIA has their motives. The mob has their motives. Texas Oil has their motives. And indeed, Lyndon Johnson has a unique relationship with all of them. Now let's talk about Johnson the man, because very much my book is a portrait of him. Lyndon Johnson was a coarse, crude, loud-mouthed bully. He was greedy, ruthless, unprincipled. He had an enormous appetite for cigarettes and alcohol and women. He believed in nothing whatsoever. He was a sadist. He was a psychopath. This is a president who conducted White House meetings while sitting on the toilet defecating. Not because he was crude, but because he enjoyed the humiliation and embarrassment it caused these Ivy League Kennedy aides that he had inherited from Jack Kennedy. This is a man who fathered 3 illegitimate children while he was president or vice president. Their names are in the books. The details are in the books. This is a man who, as a child, tied a stick of dynamite to a dog and blew it up. This is a man who beat a mule to death in the town square when he was a teenager. This is someone who is an amoral psychopath. And in my book, I tie him to not the murder of Jack Kennedy, but 8 previous murders. Murders to cover up corruption. Corruption of epic proportions. Corruption of biblical proportions. Lyndon Johnson would steal a hot stove. Indeed, Life magazine finds in 1963, despite the fact that he's only been a high school teacher, a congressman, and a U.S. senator, and he's been on the public payroll his entire life, he is worth $25 million. Today, that would be $150 million. How's the standard bribe work? It's very simple. You want a piece of legislation, you want a contract, you buy fake advertising at Johnson's radio station that he owns in Austin. The advertising never runs, but that's where you pay your bribe. Johnson enters public service penniless, and he leaves a multi-millionaire. Let's talk about that trail of murder. 1951, Sam Southwick, a man who is a party to the theft of the 1948 election. Now, I should talk about the 1948 election. I have been active in American politics for 35 years. I have never seen an election where after the polls, 200 voters march into a polling place in alphabetical order, and they all sign in the same handwriting with the same ink. But that's what happened in Jim Wells County. So Lyndon Johnson stole his first election by a fraudulent 86 votes by adding 200 votes to the rolls at the end. And when Sam Southwick, a deputy sheriff in Jim Wells County, threatened to go to the U.S. attorney when he was jammed up and give testimony against Lyndon Johnson, he was murdered in a state prison within hours. So, I've told you what the motive is. Now let's talk about the mechanics, because otherwise my allegation would be speculation and theory. But I put forward a case in this book which is based on fingerprint evidence and eyewitness testimony. I believe that the real killer, at least one of the shooters of Lyndon Baines Johnson, is a man named Malcolm Mac Wallace. Mac Wallace is a Marine expert shot. Now, you're going to read that Oswald was a marksman. That's the U.S. Marine Corps' lowest rating. A marksman is a poor shot. A sharpshooter is a B, and the A rating, the best rating that the Marine Corps awards, is expert. Malcolm Wallace was an expert. Malcolm Wallace was a president of the student body at the University of Texas, and from that point on, every job he has is a political patronage job arranged for by Lyndon Baines Johnson. In 1951, a man named John Douglas Kinzer gets intimately involved with Lyndon Johnson's sister, Josepha. Josepha is a flamboyant, bisexual, bohemian party girl, and sometimes call girl, who works at Miss Polly's in Austin, a very famous whorehouse of the time. And Kinzer puts the bite on Johnson for money. He's essentially blackmailing him. Josepha has been deeply involved in the campaign of 1948. She knows how it was stolen. So Kinzer's trying to blackmail Johnson. Malcolm Wallace drives from Washington, D.C. in his car. He comes to Austin. He finds John Douglas Kinzer at a golf course outside of Austin. He guns him down in cold blood in broad daylight in front of witnesses. He flees. When he is apprehended minutes later, because he has Virginia license plates, by the Austin police, he tells the arresting officer, "You can't arrest me. I have to get back to Washington. I work for Senator Johnson." That affidavit is in my book. He is charged with first-degree murder. He is bailed out by two of Lyndon Johnson's largest financial contributors. He is defended at trial by John Cofer, Lyndon Johnson's personal attorney. Johnson holds up in a hotel room near the courthouse waiting for word. And Malcolm Wallace is convicted of first-degree murder. Whereupon the judge, a Johnson man, gives him a 5-year suspended sentence, and he walks out of the court a free man. Now, I checked. In 1952, every other person convicted of first-degree murder in Texas went to the electric chair. But instead, Mac Wallace went to work immediately for a company called Temco. Temco is a defense contractor owned by a man named H.D. Bird. H.D. Bird is a major financial donor of Lyndon Johnson. He's also the man who owns the Texas School Book Depository building. Malcolm Wallace leaves a fingerprint in the 6th-floor sniper's nest in the Texas School Book Depository. It's a 34-point match fingerprint. It only requires a 7-point match to be admissible in the U.S. federal courts. So now we have fingerprint evidence that ties Lyndon Johnson's personal hitman to the room from which the shot at the president was allegedly fired. We also have 6 witnesses who tell either the FBI or the Dallas Police Department or the Warren Commission that they saw movement in the 6th-floor windows just prior to the shooting. In fact, 3 of the 6 tell the authorities that they saw 2 men. And they describe a man who is heavy-set, balding, and wearing glasses. That's Malcolm Wallace. One man, Richard Carr, tells the FBI that he not only saw a man meeting Wallace's description in the window, but he also saw the same man running out of the building after the shooting, jump in a late model Rambler, and drive away. That was a major mistake on Richard Carr's part, because between 1963 and 1978, there are no less than 4 attempts on Mr. Carr's life. Somebody tries to shoot him in Texas. He moves to Montana. Somebody tries to shoot him in Montana. Then somebody tries to bomb his car in Montana. Then he moves back to Washington, D.C., but when he gets a subpoena from the House Select Committee on Assassinations, as late as 1978, When he goes to Washington, 2 men try to gun him down in the street in D.C. What did Mr. Carr see that is so important? He saw LBJ's hitman leave the building. Lee Harvey Oswald weighs 135 pounds and he's 26 years old. But 3 witnesses describe a man who was middle-aged, heavy-set, balding, and wearing glasses. Indeed, horn-rimmed glasses, 2 out of the 3 say. So, now you have eyewitness testimony and a fingerprint that tie Lyndon Johnson. So you may say to me, where is Lee Harvey Oswald? Where is he? He's on the 2nd floor where he said he was. The Warren Commission says that a Dallas police officer finds him 75 minutes after the last shot. They ask us to believe that Oswald had time to hide a rifle and run down 4 flights of stairs because the elevator's cut off as the electricity is down in the building. Indeed, as I say in my book, a woman, Vicki Butler, says that she was on the stairs at that crucial time. And she saw, and more importantly, heard no Lee Harvey Oswald because it's a wooden staircase built in the 20s. And if anyone were on it, one would hear that. So, it explains why Oswald, when he's approached by a police officer, is nonplussed. He's not emotional. He's sipping on a Coca-Cola. That's because he's on the 2nd floor eating his lunch when I think Malcolm Wallace shoots at least one of the shots. Now, I conclude that there are more than one shooter. I think there's a shooter on the grassy knoll. I think there may be a shooter in the Daltex building. Now, who else says that Lyndon Johnson is involved? Well, it's kind of interesting. Jackie Kennedy, she's never satisfied with what she's being told by Warren. She goes to French intelligence and asks them. They conduct a full investigation and they publish it. What do they conclude? Lyndon Johnson is the perp. There's a declassified memo in 1996 from J. Edgar Hoover to President Johnson, letting him know that an American spy has reported that the Soviet KGB has conducted their extensive investigation. And what do they conclude? Lyndon Johnson is the key figure in the murder of John Kennedy. E. Howard Hunt, who is clearly a CIA operative throughout his career, says on his deathbed, okay, I was in Dallas that day. I was low level. But he also says Lyndon Johnson was running the show. Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby's never allowed to speak to reporters. The Warren Commission tells us Jack Ruby had no known associations with organized crime. That's a laughable joke. Carlos Marcello owns Jack Ruby's club. Ruby is fronting in the Carousel Club for Marcello. He runs his strip club at the sufferance of Marcello. He has run guns to Cuba for Marcello. He had a criminal record of working for Al Capone when he lived in Chicago as Jacob Rubenstein. He is a button man for the mob. The Warren Commission asks you to believe that he had no known connections, that he merely felt bad about Mrs. Kennedy's plight. In fact, if you go to YouTube, you can see actual footage. Jack Ruby being pulled down a hallway in handcuffs by 2 police officers. And a reporter shouts out, Jack, Jack, how could this happen? And Ruby says, if Adlai Stevenson were vice president, this never would have happened. Reporter says, Jack, what do you mean? What are you saying? He says, look at the man who's in there now, the man at the top. That's Lyndon Johnson. Senator Barry Goldwater, he knew it was Lyndon Johnson. Robert and Jackie Kennedy, they knew it was Lyndon Johnson. Robert Kennedy sends an emissary, William Walton, an artist who's a friend of Jacqueline Kennedy's, one of the first openly gay men in America. He goes to the Soviet Union where he has cultural relationships. He meets with the KGB and he gives them a message from the Kennedys. One, they say, we know that John Kennedy was killed by a domestic conspiracy, meaning the Russians had nothing to do with it. 2, they said Dallas was the perfect place for the crime. And 3, the elevation of Lyndon Johnson is unfortunate and a grievous problem. They knew. Robert Kennedy tells his assistant Walter Sheridan, I know exactly what happened, but there's nothing I can do about it now, which is true. Because despite the fact he still has the title of Attorney General, the power has shifted to Lyndon Johnson. So who is Bobby going to go to? The FBI? They're conducting the cover-up. In any event, I think I make a compelling case. My goal here has always been the same. I'm not a lawyer. But I want you to read my book and put it down and say, guilty. Guilty as hell. I think that it is an overwhelming case against Lyndon Johnson. As the Greeks say, cui prodest seclist est fict. The person who derives the greatest benefit from the crime is the person who committed it. Lyndon Johnson is the linchpin of the crime. Why? Because in 1963, murder is not a federal crime, it is a state crime. And therefore the investigation would be conducted by the Dallas Police Department, the Dallas County Sheriff's Office, and the Dallas County District Attorney. Indeed, Cliff Carter, a henchman for Lyndon Johnson, calls from Air Force One to Henry Wade, the district attorney, and says, you are to indict Oswald for murder, a state crime, but not conspiracy, a federal crime. Johnson wants no federal investigation. Let me say in conclusion, people have asked me at all of these terrific book signings we've had, you're accusing the Warren Commission of treason. These learned men, these congressmen, these senators, the Supreme Court justice. And it's very simple why they do what they do. Because Lyndon Johnson tells them all the same thing. The Russians did it. There's not one iota of evidence or proof to that fact. It was not an international conspiracy. But Johnson says the Russians did it. The American people will demand retribution. We're talking about nuclear war, World War III, millions will die. Justice Warren, you must help me button this up for the good of the people. Do it for your country. Indeed, I was a friend of Arlen Specter's. We argued about this over martinis, usually. He is a very ambitious, abrasive, smart, tough guy, and he's merely doing what the Chief Justice and Alan Dulles, the former CIA director on the Warren Commission, are telling him to do, which is create the fiction of the single bullet theory, create the fiction that Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist. That's nonsense. His background as a communist is fabricated, and that he acted alone. So, my goal here is very simple. No one is going to retry Lyndon Johnson for murder. But if young people, if any American reads my book and reaches the conclusion that the government does not tell you the truth, that a government that will lie to you about the assassination of a president, will lie to you about Benghazi, will lie to you about healthcare, will lie to you about the economy, will lie to you about the debt, will lie to you about everything, that everything government says requires a healthy skepticism, then I will have achieved my goal. Thank you all very much for coming. I'd be happy to take any questions. Sir.
I've read some books on the Kennedy assassination, and can you explain a little bit about the mechanics of how they went about to kill him? It all started in Carlos Marcello's area down there in Louisiana, and you've got all these weird characters. How did they all get to Dallas? How did they all plan the triangulation turkey shoot? How did all that occur? And Hoover and everyone else had to have been in it and prepared to go ahead immediately to go with a cover-up, because this is not an after-fact thing. Oh, they did it. Oh,
yeah. No, I think that this is maybe 2 years in the planning.
Yeah.
I think that that there are potential plots planned for Chicago and also for Tampa that are banded for various mechanical reasons. Oswald was not set up as the patsy. I believe he's a patsy. He's a fall guy. The CIA has maneuvered him there. We don't know what he's been told. We're going to have a simulated attempt on the president's life. It's a drill. Or you're there as a part of an abort team. We believe there'll be an attempt on the president's life. We have no idea what Oswald has been told. We do know this. They keep telling us that he killed Officer Tippit. Really? Well, how come the guns from the bullet that killed Tippit don't match the revolver that Oswald is arrested with in the theater? Simple. Answer that one, Arlen Specter. The truth is, I believe Tippit's killed with an automatic and Oswald's holding a revolver when he's arrested. And the FBI report says, you can read it in the Warren Commission, they can't match the bullets. The government relies on one witness who says they saw Oswald kill Tippit. I think she's unreliable. There are multiple other witnesses who contradict that, and they are systematically ignored by the Warren Commission. So I think it is unlikely. I suspect that Tippit was on his way to kill Oswald. So The other thing we know that's interesting is that voice stress technology that wasn't available in 1963, that is available today, when you test the statements of Lee Harvey Oswald, such as, "I didn't kill anyone, I'm a patsy," that test is true. Reporter yells, "Did you shoot the President of the United States?" He says, "No, sir, I did not." That test is true. I think he's exactly what he says he is. The other thing that's interesting, of course, is that the members of the Warren Commission don't believe their own report. We know from a taped telephone call between Senator Richard Russell and President Johnson on the day that the Warren Commission report is released, and Russell, who is a man of enormous integrity despite his segregationist views, says, "I don't believe a word of it," and Johnson says, "Either do I." Yet Johnson goes on an interview with Walter Cronkite and says there was an international conspiracy to kill John Kennedy. The truth is neither the Russians nor the Cubans have motive at that time. We know that John Kennedy has done two things to enrage the military-industrial complex. First of all, I think he has concluded that Vietnam is a disaster, and he has signed an executive order to begin the withdrawal of our 16,000 advisors in Vietnam. The Monday after he becomes president, Lyndon Johnson signs a new executive order reversing that, giving the generals and the defense contractors the war they want. Now, for a long time, I did not think that was true. I thought that was liberal bull, that we were just burnishing the image of Camelot. And I based that on the fact that Robert Kennedy, in an oral history recorded in 1964, when he's asked about the withdrawal of Vietnam, he says, absolutely not. President Kennedy was committed to fighting communism. We believed in the domino theory. We weren't leaving. The thing I sadly concluded is that Robert Kennedy lied about a lot of things, and I think he's lying about this. The overwhelming documentation is that JFK was moving us towards the exits in Vietnam. But the Kennedy assassination is not about Vietnam as much as it's about Cuba policy. The CIA proposes something called Operations Northwoods. Killing Americans, in other words, the American military killing Americans, blaming it on the Cubans as a false flag to create a pretext to invade Cuba. Jack Kennedy vetoes this crazy plan. Although I would argue that the murder of Kennedy may be the ultimate manifestation of their plan, as Johnson goes to great lengths to try to blame the Cubans. Indeed, Ambassador William Atwood, who was a roommate of JFK's at Princeton, has gone to Castro and said John Kennedy would like to have quiet back-channel talks. It's time to start talking. And Castro's surprised, but he agrees. And this is supposed to be kept secret from the CIA, but I suspect they know it. As far as Khrushchev is concerned, why does he want to kill Kennedy? Just took him to cleaners in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He says in his memoirs when he learned that Kennedy had been killed, he wept. There's not an iota of evidence that the Soviets or the Cubans are involved in the murder of John F. Kennedy. Yet, only 2 weeks ago, our esteemed Secretary of State, John Kerry, says in an interview with CNN, "I never thought Oswald acted alone." He's right about that part. "I think the Russians and the Cubans did it." Completely wrong. Another question.
Mr. Stone, you mentioned briefly the perhaps possible setups in Chicago and in Tampa. Is it true that a three-man hit team was rolled up in Tampa and that Kennedy's campaign appearance to Tampa was canceled because of that, or am I getting that a bit wrong?
I think they canceled a long motorcade that would have put him at risk. But I think in both cases the Secret Service learned of the attempts and changes were made to the president's schedule to avoid his exposure. But there is no way to avoid the fact that in Dallas, the Secret Service acts in a very strange way. Now, I personally have been involved in 13 trips on behalf of presidents of the United States, and I understand that there is a process involved in mapping out the president's visit to any major city. It is important to recognize that it is Lyndon Johnson who insists that Kennedy come to Dallas. This speaks to means. Indeed, Kennedy tells Senator George Smather, the Florida senator, in his memoirs, 3 days before coming here, he's going to Texas at Johnson's insistence, and he dreads it. It is John Connally, who is the governor of Texas and a protege of Johnson, who insists on the actual little drive through Dealey Plaza. And when the Kennedy advance men, notably Jerry Bruno, JFK's chief advancement, doesn't like the route because the 120-degree turn into the Dealey Plaza requires the car to come to an almost complete halt, which puts the chief executive in danger, he's overruled by Connolly, who says, you tell the president he does it our way or the invitation is rescinded and we don't want him. Now, some people say, okay, why would Lyndon Johnson put his protege, his man, in the death car with John Kennedy, where indeed he gets shot? And the answer is, the morning of the assassination, Lyndon Johnson goes to the hotel room of John Kennedy and says, I've got a great idea. Let's have Connolly ride in my car, and we'll have Senator Ralph Yarborough, his arch rival in Democratic politics, ride with the senator, ride with the president. And JFK says no. And they have a shouting match, and Johnson storms away. How do we know this? Jackie Kennedy has written about it. So it is very clear that Johnson creates the opportunity to kill John Kennedy, and I think that that there is the CIA and the mob have worked together seamlessly in the efforts to assassinate Castro. This is not a new partnership. It's an old partnership. Another question. Yes, sir.
Do you think that the murder of Robert Kennedy was also some kind of conspiracy, or do you think that was done by an individual?
No, I think it is. I think these are connected. Here's why I say that. First of all, in my book, I report that Frank Mankiewicz, who was Robert Kennedy's press secretary and also a friend of mine of many years, confirms that 4 days before his murder in California, Robert Kennedy told a student audience that he would reopen the investigation into the murder of his brother. And that, I think, sent chills through those who had been involved. Secondarily, I think that there is some evidence that the Los Angeles Police Department botches this investigation. I think there may also be multiple gunmen. I think that was a real threat to those who had killed JFK. So I think it is essentially the same people. Here's the other reason I say that. Carter Burden. Carter Burden was a very well-known aristocratic Democrat in New York, came from a very wealthy family, ran for Congress, was a major socialite. He was a very close friend of Jacqueline Kennedy's. In the afternoon in which Robert Kennedy is shot, she calls Carter Burden and she says, they got Bobby too. They got Bobby too. I think it's the same people. By the way, I think it's also related to the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King is picked up in an FBI wiretap shortly before his murder, telling an associate that he's going to endorse Robert Kennedy for president in 1968. Johnson knows the pivotal role that King has played in 1960, where he basically tips the election from Nixon to John Kennedy in a skin-tight race. So I suspect that is also a factor in his murders. I'm deeply interested in the Robert Kennedy murder. I was an admirer of Robert Kennedy more than John Kennedy in many ways. And I think that definitive story has not yet been told either. Yes, sir.
Roger, could you describe to us what it was like to be at Dealey Plaza this past November 22nd?
Surreal. First of all, Dealey Plaza is much, much smaller than you picture it. It's very compact. There were literally, well, first of all, it's important that the city closed the site down to the average citizen for a long period of time. They did so to control the messaging of the commemorative service. They did not want this to be about questions regarding the assassination. It was billed as a celebration of John Kennedy's life. Indeed, people who were eyewitnesses to the actual assassination were not invited to participate. It was very interesting to walk the thing through. It is important, I think, to recognize the case of a man named James Tague. In other words, immediately after the murder, J. Edgar Hoover, within days, issues his report, which says, Lee Harvey Oswald, he's a communist, he acted alone, he's a lone nut, he fired 3 shots, all from behind, case closed, rubber stamp it. And the Warren Commission is preparing to rubber stamp it. The problem is that there's a man named James Tague, who was 39 years old in 1963, he's about 80 today. And Mr. Tague is in Dealey Plaza. He gets stuck in traffic, so he abandons his car. He walks to a place where he can see the motorcade go by. He sees sees Kennedy murdered. And while he's standing there, a bullet hits the curb next to him, and either a fleck of bullet or cement bounces up and cuts his cheek. A Dallas sheriff's office deputy sees this, comes up to him and says, "Hey, what happened to your face?" Tig realizes he's bleeding. He's also just seen John Kennedy's head explode like a watermelon. So he's in shock. But they take him down to the police station. He files a report. Then he hears nothing more about this shot. And the Warren Commission, according to the newspapers, is clear. The first shot hits Kennedy. The second shot hits Connally. The third shot hits Kennedy. Case closed. Well, we've got an extra shot. Now, all of a sudden, our inspector's got a major problem. A reporter named Jim Lear, later famous at PBS, writes a wire story about the uncounted shot. For 3 weeks, J. Edgar Hoover tries to say there was no shot. What are you talking about? But the U.S. attorney in Texas has already cut out the piece of the curb and has the evidence. So now our inspector has a giant problem, and therefore is born the single bullet theory. The first shot hits the curb. The second shot hits Kennedy and Connally. The third shot hits Kennedy, case closed. Nonsense. Kennedy's hit from the front the first time. There are multiple shooters, without question. Kennedy is hit from the front and the back, without question. You can't get off 3 shots in 6.5 seconds with this Mannlicher Carcano rifle. The Army couldn't duplicate it. CBS couldn't duplicate it. Nobody could duplicate it. The rifle is not even sighted. For those of you who are firearms experts, you understand. The scope was no good. It hadn't been properly sighted. So it's an absurd notion. The government goes through huge gyrations to say that he was shot simply from behind. 13 doctors and nurses at Parkland say they see a hole in the back of his head the size of a grapefruit. The doctors in Bethesda say that's not what they see. And later on, the government produces an x-ray that shows his head is entirely intact. Dan Rather is shown the Zapruder film, and he comes out and he lies. He says, the president lurched violently forward. Go look at the film. He goes back and to the left. He is hit from the front and goes back. Even Dan Rather lies. For what reason? You'd have to ask him. But it is at this point, no one with any objectivity or any intelligence could possibly still believe the results of the Warren Commission. Lee Harvey Oswald's given a paraffin test. There's no nitrogen on his face or his hands or his arms. He hasn't fired a rifle that day. The Dallas Police Department reports say that there are 2 shell casings. Somewhere along the way, the Warren Commission changes that to 3. The police officer says he scratched his initials in both, but the shells that the Warren Commission has no initials. Somebody plants a pristine bullet on the stretcher that carried John Connally and were asked to believe that it went through Jack Kennedy and Connally and remained pristine. Yet the government can't duplicate that either, despite their best tries. So, I mean, Vincent Bugliosi, I'm sure his book's here in this bookstore. Please, my friends at Books and Books, move it to the fiction section. Another question. Somebody who hasn't asked. Yes, sir.
Did you run across an approximation of how much military-industrial complex money Lyndon, or let's say his front companies, made by continuing the Vietnam War?
Well, we know this, that Lady Bird was a shrewd investor. She had big stock in Bell Helicopter. She had big stake in Brown and Root, which you may know today as Halliburton. The Johnsons' estate made millions on the Vietnam War, millions. That Lady Bird sure was shrewd when it came to investing. Hard to say. We do know, for example, that there was a $325 million contract given to Halliburton, given to Brown and Root to dredge Cameron Bay, which didn't need dredging, for example. No, I think the generals wanted their war. This is where Oliver Stone, who I'm not related to, but who I have some agreements and disagreements with, but whom I have enormous respect for, just based on his talents and his quest for the truth. We disagree on some things, but on this, I think he's fundamentally right. The generals wanted their war. The defense contractors wanted their war. Lyndon Johnson gave them their war, but he was not above making a few bucks on it himself. H.D. Bird, the man who owns the Texas School Book Depository, the man whose company Temco, that Malcolm Wallace, the assassin, went to work for, 3 months after Johnson becomes president, they get an enormous multi-million-dollar contract for the Vietnam War. That company today is known as LTV. So they get their reward for housing Malcolm Wallace after the assassination. Wallace, by the way, dies mysteriously in 1971 when someone rigs up his truck to fill with exhaust fumes and he drives off the road and hits an embankment, which sounds like murder to me. Another question.
Well, my question is why does Lyndon B. Johnson's law firm still represent him till today and covers any aspect that he was involved with this assassination?
There's a terrific book written by Barr McClellan, which I strongly recommend. I've tried to work on the scholarship of McClellan and also a man named Philip Nelson and also a fellow named Greg Zerbel who have gone before me. So the scholarship here is not new. What I've tried to do is add to it. So I had unique access to President Richard Nixon. He was a mentor of mine and was responsible for my early political career. I make no effort to rehabilitate him in this book. This isn't a partisan book, so those who say, well, you're just attacking Democrats, well, I destroyed Gerald Ford in this book. Gerald Ford, as a congressman and a member of the Warren Commission, falsified the autopsy records, moving the description of the wound from Kennedy's upper back to his lower neck to accommodate the wound in the front of his throat as an exit wound and thus expedite the government's cockamamie single bullet theory. And in my next book, I will tell you the truth. The reason that Ford pardons Nixon is because if Nixon had gone to trial in Watergate, he was taking everybody down. He was going to reveal the CIA's involvement in the Kennedy assassination. And you, Jerry, you covered up the autopsy for the Warren Commission, which Americans didn't learn until 1996 after Nixon was dead. So I'm convinced that that's another missing piece of history. I have a book coming out in September called Nixon's Secret, which I think will illuminate what's in the 18.5-minute gap in the tapes. We'll explain the pardon, and we'll talk about the relationship of Watergate to the Kennedy assassination and the Bay of Pigs. This is one thread of history, and if you look at it, they have the same participants. The same people are involved. So I will interrelate those. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for your questions and for being here. It is time to sign some books.